Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I too rise today to discuss the Fair Work Registered Organisations Amendment Bill 2014. In Australia, I believe it is reasonable for all Australians to expect those who represent their interests and are responsible for managing their funds to all be held to the same standards of transparency and of accountability. Across Australia today, there are 47 unions and 63 employer groups that have revenues between them of $1.5 billion and assets of over $2.5 billion. This is the money of more than 2 million hard-working Australian men and women who trust these organisations with their money and with the responsibility to look after their interests. These millions of hard-working Australian men and women pay their union dues, and they deserve to know their union or their employer group is acting in their best interests. Considering these organisations are also exempt from paying income tax, all Australians also deserve to know that they are fully accountable. I agree with Senator Pratt and those opposite that unions are critically important to Australia and to Australian workers. But unions, like every other organisation in this country that manages people's money and looks after their interests, must be held to the highest possible standard of accountability and transparency. But scandalously today, these organisations and their directors are not currently held to the same standards of accountability and responsibility as companies and company directors are. And I think no amount of highly skilled verbal gymnastics from those opposite can hide the fact that what many union officials are doing is quite simply wrong. In fact, it is very wrong. Many union officials, very high-profile union officials, and even the former Attorney-General, the Labor Attorney-General, Robert McClelland, have called for these reforms. In fact, Mr McClelland was quoted in The Australian in 2012 saying that there is unquestionably a case for further legislative reform. In fact, those opposite who profess to be for the workers are protecting and perpetuating an endemic culture of entitlement and abuse by union officials. But not only is this culture evident in the workplace, it is also seen in the ranks of union officials themselves. Currently, there are 113, yes, 113 CFMEU officials before the courts today. And in fact, there are 10 currently from Western Australia before the courts, making a total of 24 in all from my home state of Western Australia, which is utterly scandalous. In recent years, courts have imposed more than $8 million in fines on the CFMEU alone. As numerous judges have observed, these penalties are not enough for unions that treat the law-breaking as a standard procedure, as business as usual, and the $8 million in fines, paid for by their union member dues, are akin to parking tickets. They are just simply seen as a cost of doing business. That is scandalous, and that is an abuse, and it is absolutely evidence of an endemic culture of abuse and rorting their membership. And I've got to say, if company directors were found to have behaved in the same way that over 100 so far, just CFMEU officials have, they would be out of a job quick smart, they would be dealt with swiftly by the appropriate regulatory authorities and also by the courts. And if for these transgressions, those opposite would have been the first one to be in this place and out in the public, publicly decrying, as they should, any such abuse by the corporate sector. But I simply cannot understand how those opposite can rationalise the systemic and endemic exploitation of Australian workers, of the men and women who are members of unions, who pay their union dues, often at some financial hardship to themselves, and yet those opposite remain silent on the gross abuse of workers that they so loudly profess to support. And instead, as we've seen here in this place today, they keep trotting out the same old tired class warfare rhetoric instead of actually standing up to the unions and saying, it is wrong, it is time for you to change. The facts are indisputable. Decades and decades of royal commissions and reviews have identified a clear culture of entitlement to other people's money when it comes to the unions. Sadly, in the absence of acceptable transparency and accountability standards, abuse of union members' fees is endemic. Today, many, certainly not all, union officials use their members' fees as their own personal ATMs. Just look at the audacity of two senior West Australian Transport Worker Union officials who used branch funds to purchase themselves expensive imported Ford Utes at a price of more than $150,000 for each ute. These union officials purchased their utes courtesy of union membership funds, and then they used them as their own personal vehicles. One official felt so comfortable using his union membership fee-funded car that he actually put personalised plates on the car. But it didn't just stop there. So just before they purchased these expensive imported cars, they actually had organised for redundancies for themselves so that the vehicle could be taken with an official when departing the union. So not only did one of the officials receive a redundancy payout of $500,000, he took his $150,000 souped-up Ford Ute, again paid for by union members, he took it with him. Where were those opposite when this happened? Where were my West Australian colleagues in this place when this happened? Where were you standing up for the TWU workers when they were so egregiously ripped off? But as we all know, the audacity of union officials and others who rort any organisation, their audacity just gets bigger and bigger if left unchecked. In 2015, former Health Services Union National Secretary Craig Thompson was found guilty of misusing $300,000 for his own campaign to enter Parliament and for his many personal indulgences and, as we now know, productivities. His colleague, Cathy Jackson, also fleeced more than $1 million through cash withdrawals, holidays, artworks and other luxuries. Their membership funds, Health Services Union members who funded this nearly $1.5 million of personal expenditure. Where were those opposite? Where were those opposite decrying the exploitation of workers? This money had come from nurses, from hospital cleaners, from disability and other healthcare workers who paid their annual fees to their union to be represented, and instead they were funding a luxurious lifestyle for these officials. And where were those opposite when this happened? These are the hard-working, honest Australians who take care of our most vulnerable people, often for minimal pay, and this is the thanks they were given by the unions who they were paying to represent them. This theft could only happen because of the lax legislation and very little transparency that these union officials were able to exploit. But it doesn't stop there, Mr Acting Deputy President. In the most recent Trade Union Royal Commission, many other rorts and deceptive conduct of union officials came to light. For example, National Union of Workers officials spent money on personal holidays and a dating website. I'm sure the membership of the NUW would be delighted to know they were funding the dating habits of their union officials. One NUW official even used the members' fees to spring for a KISS concert corporate box for his family. So he used his union card to pay $7,740 for a corporate box at a KISS concert, which was the famous "I was made for rorting you" story in the Daily Telegraph. The same New South Wales Secretary, NUW, spent nearly $5,000 on his union credit card again for a New Year's Eve party for his family, and $1,500 on a flight for his wife to Hong Kong. Where were those opposite when the NUW members were being so egregiously rorted? Nowhere to be seen. But it didn't stop there in the NUW. The officials and staff used their corporate cards to buy luxury holidays worth more than $18,000, sports tickets worth over $4,000, toys worth $670, and over $2,500 on dating websites, hairdressing, iTunes purchases, and more than $1,500 on other personal purchases. Shockingly, for me, as a senator for Western Australia, CFMEU officials who were receiving kickbacks from underworld figures raided redundancy funds for staff. Redundancy funds were raided to pay workers who are unlawfully striking on the building site of the new Perth Children's Hospital. That is beyond contempt. And where were those opposite? Where were my Senate colleagues from the Labor Party when all this was happening? Nowhere to be seen and nowhere to be heard. The TWU appointed its own Assistant State Secretary, Mr John Berger, as the Tasmanian Superannuation Liaison Officer for TWU Super from 2009 to 2012. In the financial year 2011-2012, Mr Berger spent 5 days in Tasmania. 5 days. And how much do you think he got paid by the union for 5 days of work? $93,434 for 5 days' work. Mr Berger finally had to agree, albeit somewhat reluctantly, that the invoice put in was actually for $93,000 was actually for 2.5 days' work, not even the 5 days' work. When he was the AWU National Secretary, the leader of the opposition's union accepted a secret donation of $40,000 from Cleanlevant to fund his campaign for Parliament, a fact he disclosed only when it was exposed by the Royal Commission. In his capacity as AWU National Secretary, Mr Shorten also signed an EBA with Cleanlevant that cut a number of award conditions. Yes, cut award conditions, including penalty rates for the workers of his own union. And what was the cost? What did he get in return? Cleanlevant agreed to pay the union $25,000 per year for 3 years in return for the names of their workers and a deal that stripped the workers of their penalty rates. That is scandalous. And where were those opposites standing up for the workers? Mr Shorten was the organiser for Cleanlevant when it entered a 1999 EBA with the AWU and was reportedly responsible for the 1999 deal that set low pay and conditions that applied not for the next 4 years, 10 years, but set them at that low rate for 15 years. Mr Caesar Mellon of the Australian Workers' Union repeatedly issued false invoices to companies, marking them training, OH&S or similar, when they were in fact used to pay union membership to boost the union's power within the ALP. False invoices to raise money to pay for extra influence in the Labor Party organisation itself. The AWU membership roll contained the names of workers and horse racing jockeys who had never even agreed to become members of the union. Where were those opposite? Where were those opposite when the AWU workers were again being ripped off by their union? From these few examples, and sadly there are many, many more, it is clearly evident that the current laws in force are far too lax and do not ensure that unions and employer group officials are suitably accountable and are acting in the best interests of the workers they represent. Over 4 years, our systems and laws remain unchanged. Hard-working Australians are still being shamelessly exploited and ripped off by unions and employer group officials. This is why the Coalition Government has introduced this bill, to ensure that the interests of all hard-working Australian men and women, whether they are championed by unions or not, have their best interests looked after. But it is not just those on this side of the chamber who are seeking equal standards of accountability and transparency to protect Australian workers from the worst excesses of rogue union officials. For example, the former AWU Secretary, Mr Paul Howes, said, "I can't see any reason why anyone in the union movement would fear having the same penalties that apply to company directors. And he said this is Paul Howes: "If you're a crook, you're a crook. If you're a crook, you are a crook." How true. Former ACTU president, no less, Martin Ferguson himself, has said there is an absolute obligation on the union movement to clean up its house. There is an obligation on the unions to put their house in order. Former ACTU secretary Bill Kelty said, "I was always on the side of the debate which said that unions are public bodies, so they are accountable to members for their management." Senator Urquhart herself in this chamber stated in 2005, "It is her and Labor's belief that officers of registered organisations or anyone in a position of trust who misuses the funds of members or who acts inappropriately or who takes benefits they're not entitled to must never be condoned." Now, in relation to two issues that Senator Pratt raised in relation to her amendments, I'd like to now come and address those. The first one is the proposed LP amendment in relation to ASIC being the regulator. Commissioner Hayden considered in detail whether ASIC should regulate registered organisations, and he strongly recommended against this approach because he believed, after careful consideration, that transferring the regulation of registered organisations to ASIC risks diverting ASIC from its core responsibilities, which is the regulation of corporations and also of financial services. It could also result in inadequate focus on the regulation of registered organisations. Additionally, he observed this, that sharing the regulation of registered organisations between ASIC and the Fair Work Commission would cause many great practical and administrative difficulties from having two regulators regulating in the same space. And I think very clearly from the outcomes of the Trade Union Royal Commission, it is absolutely essential that there is a strong and a dedicated regulator of registered organisations. Now, in relation to the other, one of the other amendments that Labor is proposing that Senator Pratt just raised, in terms of volunteers should be excluded from this bill. In our view, that would be a seriously retrograde step, because currently all officials, whether they are paid or whether they are volunteers, have responsibility for financial management and have obligations under the Fair Work Registered Organisations Act 2009. And our amendments to the Act will not change the current situation. And there are actually a number of very important reasons for this. And I'll give you two words. Cathy Jackson. Cathy Jackson is the exact example of why this should not change. So for her last position with the HSU, she was a volunteer. Those opposite may not have known this, but she was a volunteer. She was the honorary National Secretary. But under Labor's proposal, she could not have been held accountable for any wrongdoing in her role because she is a volunteer. Labor must surely know that their proposed amendments to exclude volunteers would create a major loophole that could be exploited by an official with bad intentions, such as Cathy Jackson. There is absolutely no reason why misappropriation of members' funds by a volunteer should be considered less serious than misappropriation by a paid official, because, as Martin Ferguson said, a crook is a crook, whether you are paid to do your job or whether you are a volunteer. This approach has been taken for charities and not-for-profit organisations where directors, who are often also volunteers, are not exempt from the Corporations Act obligations. So we see no reason, no good reason, why that should change. So, Mr Acting Deputy President, the facts are very simple and clear. If those opposite are truly acting in the benefit of hard-working Australians and union members in particular, and they genuinely believe that if you're a crook, you're a crook, and it doesn't matter whether you're paid, whether you're a volunteer, whether you're a company director or whether you're a union official, you should be subjected to the same standards of accountability and transparency. It is a very simple and clear prospect, and Australian people deserve nothing less.
Thank you, Senator Reynolds. Senator Carr.